Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was adopted by Uchiha Mikoto. Uchiha Mikoto takes the hand of an outcast child, and with it rewrites the destiny of her clan. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 7. Mikoto waited patiently for Itachi to return from his patrol on Konoha's massive walls, whenever that might be. The start and end time of the shifts were slightly randomized every day, to lessen the chance an intruder would be able to make use of a stolen patrol schedule. It also made Itachi extraordinarily difficult to catch upon his arrival, since he seemed to make a conscious effort to avoid everyone but Sasuke, and then disappeared behind his locked door until mealtime. She threw on a jacket and gloves, and pulled the old broom out of the tool shed to begin sweeping the front walk free of leaves as slowly as possible. The only way he could avoid her now was by vaulting over the wall. Her fingers were tending toward numb by the time her eldest son finally stepped around the bend, his gear bag slung over his shoulder, and his eyes fixed on the stones. She paused in her sweeping to smile at him. "How was your day?" she asked. "Uneventful," he said blandly, making to brush past her with the barest minimum of courtesy. "I ran into Kakashi-san at the park today," she said to his back. That got a reaction, although not much of one. His sandals scraped on the stones, as he turned to look back at her. "And I think you know what I mean when I say ran into," she said, with a hint of a challenge in her voice. "I do not," he answered, still with that flat, opaque tone. "I haven't spoken to him today. Please excuse me, I'd like to wash up before dinner." He turned on his heels, and continued walking briskly to the entrance of the house. She heft the broom, and went after him, taking out some of her frustration with him on the undeserving door. Did he really think she was as blandly passive as the face she put on for his father? He knew she had been, or maybe still was, a shinobi. She slammed the door behind her, and jogged a little to catch up. He was very tall for his age, and had longer legs than she did. He'd taken the covered walkway outside of the house, and that was where she caught up with him. She stopped short when she realized what he was staring at. Sasuke was dangling by his ankle, like a plucked chicken, from the large tree in the yard, his belt and pouch of practice kunai sitting in front of Naruto. His face was already very red, but it intensified when he registered that Itachi was here to witness this humiliation. "Get me out of this," Sasuke growled at his grinning captor. "Not until you admit I'm awesome," Naruto answered smugly, from his seat in the tree roots. He was resting his hands behind his head, and looking more relaxed than anyone could possibly be in this cold. He smiled even wider at Mikoto and Itachi when he noticed he had an audience. Mikoto scowled at them, and put her free hand on her hip. "Naruto, let him down before he passes out, and gently. A broken wrist is a much bigger problem for him than it is for you." Sasuke. Environmental awareness. Yeah, Mom, I know," he said in a small voice, as he twisted forlornly in the wind. Naruto disappeared into the arborvitae, and fiddled with the rope's hidden anchor. He stood, and put some slack into it with a grunt of effort, inching Sasuke down as slowly as he could. He stopped when Sasuke's head was a hand's width from the ground, and his forearms were just resting in the grass. "Come on, say it," he whispered out of the corner of his mouth. "You stink," Sasuke whispered back. "Naruto," Mikoto said, warningly, taking a few steps forward. He grinned at her, and lowered Sasuke the rest of the way down, who landed in an undignified tangle. "Hi," Naruto said brightly, tossing the rope aside, to let Sasuke cut himself free. "You must be Itachi?" "Uzumaki Naruto-kun," Itachi said. "Your reputation has preceded you." Naruto stomped up to the lip of the covered porch, looking insulted. "It did not," he said. "Do you even know what that means, you retard?" Sasuke interjected, as he sawed at the rope with a dull kunai from the pouch in front of him. Itachi regarded the huffing boy with cool curiosity. "It means, to come before, and is certainly no insult. I mention this only because you apparently outran an Umbu sentinel, when he caught you packing the theater ventilation system with weak old fish heads." "Yeah, well, that jerk owner had it coming," Naruto explained, utterly unrepentant. Last week he tossed me out right at the beginning of Curse of the Mind Leeches, even though I really bought a ticket that time. Snatched it right out of my hand when I showed it to him, and nobody chased him down for stealing from me. Sasuke was still struggling with the rope and blunt blade. Itachi took notice of his difficulties, and drew out a kunai from his holster to toss it casually in the direction of the tree trunk, without taking his eyes off Naruto. It landed with a thunk above his brother's head. Sasuke reached up, pulled it out, and mumbled his thanks. "If I may ask," Itachi said, "how did you manage it?" "Nobody wanted them anyway, so I just waited until it got dark, and jumped into the dumpster behind the fishmongers with a garbage bag, and I meant outrun Umbu." "Are you kidding?" "I do it, like, all the time," Naruto declared proudly. "Nobody knows Konoha like I do, and grown-ups are too big to fit through half my secret shortcuts. It got a lot easier after the old man told them they're not allowed to throw stuff at me. But I didn't think that was fair, so I said they could use those needle thingies if they wanted to, those don't hurt very much." Naruto paused and rubbed at his nose. "Man, our Umbu guys really suck." "Well, mostly it's doggy face. Jesus, he's slow. When I'm Hokage, they'll have to shape up, or I'm gonna fire 'em all." On the porch, Mikoto cocked her head in thought. Umbu sentinels had better things to do than chase after 7-year-old vandals. And as she'd just learned, Kakashi wore a canine mask, although he was only one of several among Konoha's Umbu that did so. Maybe this was his slightly twisted way of spending some time with his sensei's son. Having been made a genin so young, Kakashi didn't exactly have a lot of experience in playground games. But, what they were doing could be called tag if you stretched the definition to include blade weapons and possible prison time. "Hound," Itachi corrected mildly, confirming Mikoto's supposition. "And there are not many who would feel the need to level the field, when being pursued by Umbu agents." "Why not?" Naruto asked, genuinely curious. "It's more fun that way." Itachi looked intently at him, as if prying for the sarcasm that ought to have been interlaced with such a statement. After some consideration, he decided to take it at face value. Correctly, he judged Naruto to be unfamiliar with such a concept. "I cannot imagine. They obviously do not have your well-developed sense of fair play." Sasuke had finally succeeded in freeing himself from the thick coil of rope, and stood up, dusting some crumbled leaves from his pants. He cleared his throat, and looked sheepishly at Itachi. "He totally got lucky with that, you know," he mumbled, and took a few steps toward the porch, intending to return the kunai. Naruto's face went stiff, and he snapped around. "No, crap, don't." Sasuke looked down as an almost invisible tripwire bit into shin. "Move," he finished lamely. Simultaneously, there was a clicking sound from the walls, and dozen slender bamboo stakes came sailing toward Sasuke. He yelped, and dove to the ground, rolling out of the impact radius. Before Mikoto could react, Itachi raised his head, and exhaled sharply through pursed lips. She barely had time to notice the ends of the projectiles were fitted with suction cups, rather than something actually dangerous, before they were completely incinerated by the ball of flame. In hindsight, Itachi's instinctive reaction was probably overkill. There was a breath of silence. "That was freaking awesome!" Naruto shrieked at him, as the ashes of his makeshift arrowheads drifted away on the wind. "I didn't see you use any hand signs or anything." Sasuke picked himself up off the ground, again very red in the face. "That didn't count either," he muttered. "Mom told you a million times not to set trip lines in the house." Naruto ignored him, all of his attention on Itachi. Sasuke scowled. He wasn't used to being ignored by Naruto. "Finally, a worthy opponent," Naruto said, sliding his feet wide, and jabbing his finger in the general direction of Itachi's chest. "I challenge you to. I am a jonin." "That would be unwise." Right, your mom doesn't like us sparring all out in the house anyway," Naruto said, favoring the tight-lipped Mikoto with a toothy, and somewhat apologetic smile. "How about you teach me how to do that instead?" Sasuke sniffed, and crossed his arms over his chest. "Lost cause," he muttered sourly. "No," Itachi, predictably, answered. "Pfft. You are 100% as lame of a big brother as Sasuke said you were, Naruto said. Sasuke's eyes flicked back and forth between Naruto and Itachi. What? I never, he said, horrified. Naruto wrapped his arm around Sasuke's shoulders, intensifying the other boy's expression of mortification. Nah, but you were thinking it. Well, whatever. We can figure it out ourselves if your big sister is too busy brushing her hair, and doing her makeup and stuff, to teach us ninjutsu. Come on, Sasuke, he said, with finality, and steered him towards the front door. Sasuke pushed Naruto away with a huff, and started towards the door on his own. Seriously, if you don't take that back about my brother, I'm going to hurt you. Naruto grinned and trotted after him, completely ignoring the less than serious threat, and launching into a grand plan to master the Gokakyu no Jutsu before the weekend. Mikoto simply stood there, her mouth hanging open, and her irritation with Itachi momentarily forgotten. Yes, he did wear his hair long, because he couldn't be bothered to cut it regularly, and, yes, he had inherited her long, luxuriant eyelashes, but nobody teased Itachi that way. Ever. The other children had been too terrified of him, and his family much too formal, and even his sensei Shisui's brotherly ribbing had tapered off around when Itachi made Chunin. All of this had apparently washed over Naruto, who, rather like his mother, did not seem to know fear. She glanced over at a curious noise. Itachi hadn't used the opportunity of her distraction to disappear, as she would have expected, and was still standing by the steps into the garden with one hand on a beam. Itachi was laughing? On any other young man, the shallow crescent of his lips, and faint quivering of his shoulders, would barely have registered as a response, but it was more mirth than she had seen out of Itachi in a long, long time. So long she couldn't even recall what it sounded like. She propped her broom up against the wall when Itachi turned fully to look at her, still smiling faintly. He is brave, Itachi said. And for the village idiot, remarkably cunning. To be honest, I think I would have found it a challenge to evade even an apathetic Umbu agent at 7 years old. I'm surprised he lost second place to that Aburame in the class rankings. Mikoto folded her arms over her chest, looking at the remnants of the snare trap he'd constructed. It was quite clever, using the cover of the long ornamental grass to conceal the mechanism. He didn't lose anything to the Aburame, she said. There wasn't a contest. He's dead last. Itachi's eyebrows elevated slightly. The son of the Yellow Flash, who is skilled enough to evade not only his Chunin teachers but an Umbu sentinel, is dead last. Yes. Ah, he said. Since I cannot imagine every one of the academy instructors degenerated into a drooling idiot since I attended, I believe I now understand why you've tucked him under your wing. He seems to have potential. You didn't seem so pleased about that the last time Naruto came up in conversation, Mikoto pointed out. Displeased was an understatement. Itachi shrugged. I was misinformed. Rumor was unkind. He doesn't seem to be the sort of monster half of Konoha assumes he is. You can decide that after meeting him once. Mikoto asked. She was getting more confused by the second. Sasuke likes him, he said, and his voice went strangely tight. He ought to have a few good friends outside the clan. She didn't know what he meant by that. A reference to her relationship to Kushina, perhaps. Yes, that was probably it. It was a good thing to form bonds with people that didn't necessarily think and act like you. It was a rather quick reversal, but perhaps what Fugaku had said during their heated discussion the night of Itachi's return had mollified him, although she couldn't imagine what that might be. Naruto was still as much of a Jinchuriki as he had been last week. Unless this didn't really have much to do with the threat Naruto posed, but rather. Her train of thought was derailed, as it suddenly occurred to her where it was the younger boys were probably going. Sasuke had managed his very first jutsu a few days ago, having finally gotten the hang of chakra redirection with her advice. It was a big step from a simple bunshin to one of the signature Uchiha fire techniques, but she was afraid Sasuke was precocious enough to manage it. Itachi, would you do me a favor, and go with them to the pond, just this once? She asked. Sasuke already knows the hand signs inside out, and with Naruto urging him on, I'm afraid they might actually make good on that threat to master the Gokakyu. You know his control isn't very good yet. I'm afraid he could really hurt himself without at least some guidance. What was left of the laughter faded completely. That is traditionally a father-son activity. Forbid him from trying until father is ready to teach him. With Naruto in the mix, forbidding him will do precisely nothing, please. She implored. You know how much he idolizes you. He might actually pay attention to the precautionary steps, if you tell him what they are. Train with him just for today? He's probably asked you every other day since he started at the academy. You could instruct him yourself, could you not? I assume you have enough familiarity with the technique, he added archly. Mikoto sighed. That old frustration was bubbling up again. Why do you do that? She asked. Always push him away? He's starting to think you don't want him to become as great as you are. Then he is correct, Itachi said evenly, making Mikoto draw back in surprise. Perhaps I misread your intentions, but I believed we were of the same mind in this, if nothing else. She opened her mouth, and rapidly shut it again, as the deeper meaning of his words became clear. Despite all the acclaim to which he was accustomed, one thing Itachi had never become was conceited. The way he said such a thing, it was, almost sad, not spiteful. Sasuke had the same potential Fugaku had recognized in Itachi, and his elder brother could see it even if their father could not. And there was a reason Itachi would wish to shelter the boy from such attention, just like she had, whether she was fully conscious of her efforts or not. Yes. We are, she said softly, bowing her head. Itachi had been accepted into the academy just as the last of her kunoichi's fire had guttered out, and she finally started to believe the insidious lies she had been fed her entire life. An Uchiha wife was obedient to her husband in all things. She had acquiesced to the unbelievably harsh training regimen Fugaku had imposed on the 5-year-old Itachi, stood silent again as he was propelled at breakneck speed to graduation at 7, and still did not protest when he was granted special authorization to begin taking C-rank missions outside of the village at 8. He was a prodigy, yes. But he had still been a little boy without the power to refuse his father anything. His first kill was at 8 years old. 8. A genin from Iwa whose mission was to escort the merchant baron. It had been Shisui and Itachi's mission to arrest. Iwa ninja were legendarily stubborn. The merchant's young guardsman had ignored his teacher's warning to be doubly wary of anyone from Konoha with a blue star on his sleeve, and charged them anyway. Itachi's kunai found his throat before he could take 5 full steps, guided by the almost prescient power of that third tomo. The motion was probably drill perfect, all reaction, no contemplation. Draw and release. The Jonin sensei of the dying teenager had cursed him, and all Konoha shinobi, as heartless monsters, for who but a monster would make such a perfect assassin of a little child. Shisui had incapacitated the remaining Iwa shinobi, and delivered the traitorous weapons dealer to the authorities, Itachi mutely trailing in his wake. They returned without further incident, and the mission was marked a success. Shisui guided his student home, stony-faced as a proper shinobi should be, but once Mikoto had him alone, he could no longer hold back the torrent of self-reproach. It was too early and too much. That night was the closest Shisui had ever come to open conflict with the clan head, and he was so loyal he would have sworn under oath the sky was green, if Fugaku told him it was so. Itachi had shut himself in his room, and refused to speak to anyone for a full day. She had heard him sobbing through the locked door when she passed, and her whole being had wanted to take him in her arms, and brush those tears away. He wouldn't let her then, and had never done so since. That mission had almost broken Itachi, and the words of the Iwa Jonin must have haunted him to this day. It had lain in the shadows of her mind for a long time. How she should have said something, convinced her husband to allow their son the time to let his fragile young heart catch up to his talented hands. He had long ago ceased to be afraid of his father for his own sake, but it lingered on behalf of Sasuke. He didn't want his little brother's soul stained with murder before he had grown up enough to absorb the consequences. He was right, but there was room for compromise. I understand your rationale, but please, show him enough of the technique to allow him to practice without hurting himself, Mikoto said. When your father does find out he's mastered the Gokakyu, between the two of us, we should be able to keep the pace of his training to reasonable limits, and keep him from graduating early. It's not the same as when you were a genin. Konoha is almost at full strength again. The need for new shinobi isn't as pressing. We. He said, skeptical. We, she said firmly. There it was again. A shadow of a smile. I'll have Sasuke back in time for dinner, he said, and moved to leave her. He stopped in the doorframe on his way to the back of the house. And mother, thank you. Chapter 8. The autumn winds blew into one of Konoha's cool, rainy winters, and there seemed to be more and more black-cloaked figures crouching like gargoyles on the roofs of the Uchiha district. Mikoto had never really thought about it before. A number of Umbu were always on patrol within the village walls, seen and unseen, protecting the peace of Konoha from the threats without, while the military police dealt with the threats within. Kakashi's tacit promise that the surveillance on her would cease was not kept. For a censor like herself, it was torment to feel those eyes constantly on her back, the intrusive attention about which she could do nothing. She was not the only one to notice. Umbu operatives could become nearly invisible, if they wished, and most Uchiha were not paranoid enough to use the Sharingan when walking their dogs or shopping for groceries. Because Umbu did choose to stalk the clan's rooftops openly, she could only assume it was some kind of intimidation tactic. The gossip of the Uchiha wives turned away from the marital indiscretions and vicarious one-upmanship of academy scores that were their usual fodder, to more recent and troubling developments. Some of the clan members not in the police force had started to receive only low-priority, long-term missions completely unsuited to their skills, and their wives were complaining about a significant drop in their income for no good reason. Even the day-to-day police work was suffering, with the Black Ops Division inventing heretofore unknown bureaucratic delays for processing evidence, or even taking over cases entirely when they and the military police ought to have had joint jurisdiction. No one knew what was happening, and they looked to Mikoto for answers. She had none to give, only speculations and empty reassurance. Itachi began making more frequent visits to Kiri, and her son came back looking more haunted every time. Normally so calm, his temper began flaring unpredictably at everyone but Sasuke, closing him off from his family and clan. Invitations from Shisui to get a bite to eat between missions were blown off without excuse or explanation. Uchiha Anzu, the beautiful young Chunin who was doing her utmost to land a date with the prickly clan heir, was even more savagely brushed away. Under her stunning looks, she was a very mature and intelligent young woman, recently invited to serve on the personal guard of the daimyo himself. Mikoto liked her quite a bit, and she was reaching out to Itachi in a way nearly all of the shinobi his age were afraid to try. Mikoto found her on the bank of the Uchiha pond, in tears, after Itachi had finally consented to have some tea with her. He had arrived late, then spent the entirety of the short conversation hinting the skills she'd been selected for she'd demonstrated not in the arena, but on her knees in the daimyo's hotel suite. That Itachi was so casually cruel to someone so undeserving didn't even surprise her anymore. The considerate, patient son Mikoto knew and loved was dying. She felt like a stranger in her own home, a stranger in her own village. And then, one stormy night, she learned why. Oh. Mikoto shuffled into the room with dainty steps, noting each face with care, despite her downcast eyes. The paintings on the paper screens seemed to dance in the flickering candlelight. Konoha was far enough inland that the typhoon thrashing the coastline had lost most of its muscle, but, even in its weakened state, had been enough to down several power lines. No one was out save the bare minimum of Umbu sentinels, and a few unlucky service crews. 2 of the 3 elders were here. Fugaku's uncle Yujiro, brother of the previous clan head, and Ojiro, who had served beside him as the previous chief of police. The third Seiyushin was filled by Shisui, the son of the third, here in his father's stead who was in poor health. Mikoto began gracefully pouring tea for 4. Itachi was gone on a mission with Kakashi. Behind her look of serene loyalty, her mind was churning furiously. Why call a council when the heir was missing? This was not ordinary clan business. Or even out of the ordinary clan business. She was not sure exactly what his role was in this mystery, but the fact that Fugaku had entrusted Itachi with the dangerous solo missions to Kiri said that he had played the role of his father's trusted proxy. But something between them had changed, since his return from the last one. He was almost as rude to Fugaku as he was to the rest of the clan, although for the most part did as he was told. The air of conspiracy in the room oozed over Mikoto's skin. She had delayed her own investigation into the matter, convincing herself there would be a better way, and a better time, if only she waited a bit longer. Truthfully, part of her didn't want to know what they were planning. She could ignore the uneasy looks like a dutiful wife was trained to do. She could go back to the kitchen, and gossip with her maid, leaving to the men the work of governing the Uchiha. It wasn't her problem. Just like Naruto hadn't been her problem. Sometimes, she suspected she was so keen on doing the little, unimportant things herself that she had no time to spare for the big ones. Mikoto retrieved the lacquer tray, and bowed deeply to the council members, who spared her barely a scrap of attention. A well-behaved wife had the advantage of being invisible, no more worthy of suspicion than a table or a teacup. She padded out, and against her better judgment sank to her knees outside the door before sliding it shut. It was within the bounds of expected behavior for an attentive hostess. If he didn't want her to hear, Fugaku would have to tell her explicitly to leave, and that would be an admission of foul play in itself. No such order came. She let her hopes rise the slightest bit, although they would probably activate a sound suppression jutsu anyway, and all of this would be pointless. The men began murmuring in low voices, but she could catch at least some of the words. If she had been spying on anyone else, she would have cast a subtle suggestion toward them to speak more loudly. With Shisui in the room, she didn't dare. He was the undisputed master of the hypnotic powers of the Sharingan, far more skilled than herself. He could twist someone's mind around so skillfully, his victims were not even aware the thoughts echoing in their heads were not their own. Mikoto was subtle, but not subtle enough to try to cast a genjutsu of suggestion on Shisui. She forced herself to be as still as possible, and strained her ears. They were discussing Itachi, and his increasingly erratic behavior over these last few months. He was supposed to be the pipeline to the village, but had been failing in his duties. Information, the currency of the powerful, was not flowing. "He's done well establishing the alliance with the Mizukage," said a gravelly voice she recognized as belonging to Fugaku's uncle. But the speed of the negotiations left something to be desired. The Hokage became suspicious of his multiple requests for leave. Mikoto's hands tightened on the silk of her kimono. So his missions to Kiri had been unauthorized. Ostensibly, Umbu operatives took orders from only one man, the Hokage. They were supposed to be free from political and familial entanglements. That was why it was so rare for a clan as insular as the Uchiha to have a member accepted into their ranks. The Hokage knows the heir of the most powerful clan in Konoha will need time to attend to political matters, Fugaku countered. It isn't unprecedented, and I made the terms of his acceptance very clear to Sarutobi. He is still my son, and he has duties to the clan. That is not what I meant, his uncle said crossly. Of course there are political functions to attend. Sarutobi knows that. But he has not been nearly as free with his trust as we had hoped. Or he has purposely withheld information from Itachi, so as not to burden him with conflicts of interest. There was a significant pause. Perhaps he is unsure of Itachi's ability to split his attentions. Because frankly, so am I. What, exactly, are you trying to say? Fugaku asked, his voice gone dangerously quiet. That he hasn't split his attention, it's being torn in half. His uncle exclaimed, then continued in a more muffled voice that lost very little of its ferocity. He lives under your roof. Are you oblivious to how unstable he's become? He lashes out at his own kin with the flimsiest of provocations. He publicly disrespects both you and Mikoto. And just yesterday he used an A-rank genjutsu on Jiro's son, after Itachi falsely assumed he was threatening Sasuke. The boy was 9. He nearly had to be hospitalized. We never should have allowed him to join Umbu, muttered the former chief of police. He was too young. Sarutobi has filled his head with half-truths and senju nonsense. He is at war with himself, and those battles are taking their toll. A teacup hit the table with force, and she could hear liquid slosh over the table. No one called for her to come in and clean it up. No son of mine has betrayed us, Fugaku shot back. How could you even suggest such a thing? For all of our sakes, I sincerely hope that is the case, his uncle said. Nevertheless, we cannot put our faith in a boy who has proven himself unreliable. There is too much at stake. Shisui finally spoke up, the sole voice of youth. His behavior lately is cause for concern, but I don't believe Itachi has betrayed us either, he said firmly. Service in Umbu is mentally taxing even for grown men. Give him some time. We can afford a brief delay. If he would only speak to me, I'm sure I could. Are you confident you could reach him? Yojiro asked. Completely confident? The silence went on too long. I thought so, Yojiro said. I realize the bond of student and teacher is strong, but you must not allow it to cloud your vision. I do not know if he is reporting on our activities to the Hokage, or simply being obstructive, but we cannot take the risk of him betraying our cause. He must be watched, and as his closest friend you are in the best position to do so. He may find his way again, and I can only hope that he does. But if that is not the case, I trust you are capable of doing what must be done. A sharp intake of breath, from Fugaku. If it will lay your fears to rest, very well. Shisui, he ordered. Monitor his activities while he is within the village walls, who he speaks to, and where he goes. If anything is suspicious, I want you to relay that information directly to me. I understand, Shisui said, subdued. I'll do my best to convince him to rejoin us wholeheartedly. He's always looked up to me, and my words might still have some weight with him. If I can't, know that my loyalties are only to the Uchiha. Your father would be proud of you, Yojiro said. Your devotion to the clan is unimpeachable. Thank you, sir, Shisui murmured, although the compliment seemed to sting him a little. What the Senju have done to us is unconscionable. With your guidance, I will lead Konoha into a new era, and finally realize what Madara-sama began. He paused, and said with some sadness, although I would hope to do so with Itachi at my side. It would be only fitting for two brothers, in spirit if not in blood, to lead the clan again, Fugaku agreed. Mikoto almost stopped breathing. Madara-sama? Officially, the Uchiha held Madara in contempt as a traitor. A disgrace. A black mark on the history of Konoha. But behind closed doors, the shame the council felt wasn't because Madara had challenged the Shodai. It was because he challenged the Shodai and lost. When the clan had been assembled, and the vote taken, a century ago, the Uchiha were bitterly weary. They craved a home, any home, even with the Senju as their neighbors. After so long at war, their children had no place to play, and their elders no place to rest their tired bones. Madara had possessed all the power in the world, and had no need for such comforts. Despite what he delusionally believed, there had been no trickery or coercion involved in the collective decision to select Senju Hashirama as the Shodai. There hadn't been any need. Madara was their leader, and he refused to recognize what his clan was crying out for. For that they turned their backs on him. The majority of the Uchiha recognized Hashirama's wisdom, and the value of his truths. They cast their grudges aside, and worked alongside their old enemies to make something greater than the sum of its parts a real home, and the first of the hidden villages was born. Time had dulled the sharp prick of that wisdom, it seemed. The old hawks were restless. But why would this surface now, of all times? Under the second reign of the Sandaime, Konoha was peaceful and prosperous. They were arguably the strongest of the 5 greater villages. The Kyubi was no longer a threat. And the strange treatment of the Uchiha had only begun after Itachi contacted the Mizukage, so this plan must have had deeper roots. She was missing pieces. Critical pieces. But there was no mistaking what she did here. Fugaku was planning to install Shisui as the Go-Daime Hokage, under explicit control of the Uchiha clan council. To do that, he would need to get rid of Sarutobi Hiruzen, and his current council of Konoha. Such canny shinobi could only be overcome quickly if they were taken unawares, and for that they would need an agent on the inside, to drive the blade in when the time was right. No wonder Itachi was being driven mad. For the first time in his life, he was part of a team of his peers that judged him only on who he was, not what he was. Umbu looked past age, gender, rank, and clan merit was everything. They took the most perilous of missions, and had to place absolute trust in their companions to succeed. When wearing his mask, when he was the wolf, Itachi had no legacy to uphold. He was simply part of the team. Even when he was Uchiha Itachi, Kakashi seemed to genuinely like him on a personal level, perhaps seeing both a kindred spirit and a chance to redeem the bond he'd lost along with Obito. The fondness seemed to be mutual, inasmuch as Itachi was willing to express such a sentiment. Until his first mission to Kiri he'd spent a great deal of time in his captain's company. And now Itachi was being asked to violate that trust in the most repugnant way possible. The conversation of the elders turned away from the coup, but she stayed there as if frozen. The candles burned down, and the rain beating against the shingles faded to a quiet drumming, then to nothing. She sat in the darkness, until she heard the crackling of arthritic knees, and rose. One by one the council filed out past her bowed head. She left the tea things for the morning, and retreated to the bedroom, stowing away the formal kimono in a daze and donning her nightgown in its place. Her elderly cat stalked over to her place by the window, twining its bony body around her ankles, until she lifted it into her lap. She stroked it absently until it thrummed with contentment. So many things settled into place, all of them weights in Mikoto's heart. Above all, she felt betrayed. She had been a shinobi, a jonin, a leader. She still was. Perhaps Fugaku trusted her to keep silent, but not enough to ask for her counsel before entangling her family in treason. He thought she was nothing, powerless, that as soon as he'd gotten her pregnant all that training and experience had somehow evaporated. Perhaps 6 months ago she would have accepted his judgment, but not now, once she'd gotten a taste of authority again, and realized how much she savored it. Beneath the betrayal she was blindingly angry. He didn't want to do it, but all of them had left that room with the understanding that Itachi was to be eliminated, if he compromised their plots. Mikoto would do anything to keep her children safe. It was torture enough to see Itachi leave on his missions, not knowing if he would come back. To know that his own father might be just as much of a threat to his life was more than she could bear. And the thought of Shisui so calmly accepting this, it was obscene. Until today, she had been extremely fond of the young man. Shisui had been a frequent guest at family dinners, and when he called her Mikoto Obazan, he meant it, although she wasn't technically his aunt. Years ago, Itachi used to trail after the older boy like a lost gosling, begging to learn just one more shuriken jutsu in exactly the manner Sasuke now did for him. When he graduated from the academy at 7, it was Shisui that was selected as his sensei, tutoring him exclusively. He made Jonin fairly young himself, and even after Itachi no longer required a teacher's watchful eyes, they remained as close as the brothers to which her husband had alluded. Until her son had joined Ambu, he had no one else she could describe as a friend. The children his age regarded him with awe and no little fear, and the adults of equal rank couldn't bring themselves to socialize with a boy whose voice had yet to change. The cat started, and made a judicious leap off her lap, when it heard Fugaku coming up the stairs. Mikoto stayed where she was, and swallowed back as much of her anger as she could. Her husband stopped behind her, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest. "You're upset with me," he said. Fugaku had a gift for understatement. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered fiercely. "Would you really order Shisui to?" He straightened, and took a step nearer, sweeping away a few locks of hair falling over her collarbone. "Itachi is no traitor. You know this as well as I do," he said, failing to answer the question. Maybe it was because he himself didn't know the answer, but that meant he was considering whether Itachi's life was worth trading for a chance at vengeance. "And I kept the plans secret until now only to protect you," he said, placing his hands on her bare shoulders. "Why else? You know I trust you. No one else has been told outside of the clan council. A few more preparations are required before we bring the rest of the Uchiha into the fold." "But why at all?" Mikoto persisted. "We have everything we wanted. Konoha is strong, and the Uchiha were respected wherever we went." "And that is what the Hokage and his council wanted you to believe," Fugaku said, bitter, withdrawing his hands. "We were not respected. We were held at arm's length, and tossed scraps of real power. The police are still outranked by Ambu. Our clan was herded into this pen, in which we now live, and we are constantly watched. They only became so blatant about the surveillance after the meeting with the Mizukage. We were under suspicion long before." "Suspicion of what?" "That it was an Uchiha that unleashed the Kyuubi, 7 years ago." Mikoto gasped despite herself, turning to face him with disbelief. That was utterly absurd. It had been an accident. The strain of Kushina's laboring had somehow weakened the seal that held the demon inside of her, and her husband, although powerful, was only human. He couldn't keep the seal sustained, and as Naruto was brought into the world, so was the Kyuubi. Minato and Kushina had given their lives to help rectify that failure, or so she had always assumed. Several dead Umbu agents and Sarutobi by Osama were found near one of the shrines outside the walls, the night the Kyuubi attacked, he said. She was mortally wounded, and kept herself alive only with her advanced medical jutsu, until she could pass on the information she'd gained about the identity of their attacker. It was a strange man in a white mask. His eyes were red. Fugaku went quiet. With the death of the Shodai, the only remaining power that could even hope to control a Biju is the Sharingan. But it wasn't. Of course it wasn't. He exploded, savage. All of it was lies. It was Shimura Danzo's men that found her, at which point she very conveniently breathed her last. That broken old man has always envied the Uchiha. He saw an opportunity to eliminate us, and planted the seeds of our dishonor. The Hokage may not trust him, but he couldn't ignore the possibility that his wife's last words were true. Sarutobi Hiruzen may pretend to care only for smoking his pipe and kissing babies in these peaceful times, but he's a shinobi. He'll eliminate any threat to Konoha that shows its face. Mikoto was silent, reeling, as Fugaku continued. The destruction wreaked by the Kyuubi was indiscriminate. The Uchiha gave more in the defense of Konoha than any other clan, and this is our reward. The muscles of his jaw were shuddering in barely controlled fury. Everything Madara-sama warned us about is coming true. We swallowed our pride. We compromised. We sacrificed. We gave the Senju everything they asked for, even our lives. What fools we were. From this point forward, there will be no more compromises. We will take back everything they stole from us, starting with the robes of Hokage. But she mustered finally. What about a diplomatic solution? You just said he doesn't fully trust Danzo. Couldn't you have spoken to him? Convince him we did nothing wrong. You think I didn't try? Fugaku said. I was in off-the-record talks with the council for 3 months. Every time I met with Sarutobi, he would act as obliging and compassionate as ever, but whenever I thought we'd reached an understanding he'd spit it back in my face. I've never met such a shameless liar. The whole time all he wanted to do was show me how tightly he had the Uchiha leashed. Poor mission distribution, low security clearance, delayed survivor benefits, lost paychecks, it was a farce. If he had entered those negotiations in good faith, I would never have even dreamed of pursuing such a drastic resolution. He crossed his arms over his chest, his words steeped in bitterness. I cannot allow my clan to be treated with such disrespect. And I won't have Itachi and Sasuke grow up to perform as the Hokage's trained dogs. So this was the point, where everything came together. The whispers, the insinuations, the secret meetings. Mikoto saw herself balanced on a sword's blade, buffeted by winds from both sides. She was an Uchiha before all else, wasn't she? If Fugaku's words were true, and she felt, in her bones, that they were, then it was she who had been betrayed along with the rest of her clan. Aiding in the coup wouldn't be treachery. It wouldn't even be vengeance. It would be justice. She bowed her head, letting his rage wash over her, making it her own. Madara was a monster. But that didn't mean he couldn't be right. Why couldn't Itachi see that? I had no doubt you would understand, he said, pleased, when she offered no words of resistance. I truly wish I could have told you before now, but we needed to be sure of the Mizukage's support before we could begin the preparations in earnest, he explained. And now that we have it, our victory over the Senju sympathizers is assured. The Uchiha could hold off Iwa, we did it before, and we can do it again. But Kumo is still sore about the resolution to the kidnapping attempt against the Hyuga heir, and they would barely need the excuse to retaliate. We wouldn't emerge victorious fighting a war on 2 fronts, by ourselves. We needed an alliance. The only reliable way to get troops from Kumo to Konoha is by sea. And they would have to pass through waters patrolled by Kiri to do it. Can I ask what they wanted in return? She said, wary of any assistance from that quarter. They were no friends of Konoha. Until its destruction, They had clashed almost constantly with the Fuinjutsu masters of Konoha's close ally Uchiha. Due to the bloodline purges, they were also the weakest of the 5 great villages, and Kumo rivaled Konoha as the strongest. They did have the best navy, by dint of their elemental affinity. Just as the majority of Konoha shinobi had a primary affinity for fire, Kiri shinobi possessed mostly water. There was no worse place to engage one than in the open ocean. Still, something did not sit right with her. Little enough that it wouldn't sting too much to pay, he assured her. Food, mostly. The typhoon season was brutal, and half the dikes broke. Their rice paddies were flooded with seawater. They're willing to antagonize Kumo for some shipments of rice? She asked, skeptical. Ah, he affirmed. Their soil will be poisoned with sea salt for another year, and by that time water country would be locked in famine. Even shinobi can't fight for long on empty stomachs. He shifted his weight against the wall, so their eyes no longer met. And they'll be taking a few old relics of the Shodai off our hands. Nothing too dear to part with, he said, a response far too vague for her comfort. It's late. Please, come to bed. Mikoto felt a terrible shiver of unease, and pretended it was a draft, as she meekly slipped into bed beside her husband, once he had changed into a sleeping robe. The bloodthirsty Mizukage did not seem the type to be a collector of antiques. All he was interested in was destruction. It was rumored he was the vessel of the Sanbei, and a shinobi with that much raw power would gain only a very small advantage in battle using one of the trinkets in Konoha's vaults. Really, the only thing liable to tempt him was the thing that outshone the most powerful of those relics, like the sun outshines a candle flame. And the malleable young boy that was its keeper. Fugaku had been so close. He'd turned her world on its head, and she was so angry she would have followed him wholeheartedly into bloody revolution. Perhaps he truly believed the village would be better off without him, but Fugaku was not going to turn her Naruto over to a beast like the Mizukage. The thought abruptly cooled her anger towards Sarutobi Hiruzen, and let her take hold of her reason again. Mikoto had built her very successful career as a shinobi on manipulating the expectations of others, and her nose for deceit was as fine as they come. Despite what Fugaku believed, she could not completely accept that the Senju had reneged on their bargain. They built their clan on a purity of intention so deeply held that all 3 former Hokages had died in battle protecting it. In the chaos before the founding of the village, like-minded clans Sarutobi, Hatake, Hyuga, Nara, Yamanaka, Akimichi and more had flocked to the Senju banner because they promised a world that could be better. A world founded on trust, camaraderie, and self-sacrifice. She wasn't so cynical as to believe it was all an act. Minato's face flashed through her mind, when he was still Minato, and not Yondaime-sama, open, honest, fumbling sweetly for her best friend's affections. Possessing a gentleness of spirit that weathered the difficult decisions he was forced to make in the lives he chose to end. Driven to prove himself to his sensei as worthy of the monumental task offered to him. She knew that man as she did not know the other Hokages, and she was sure he would never stoop to oppressing her clan over a grudge that died a century ago. If Sarutobi Hiruzen had wholeheartedly embraced such a man as his successor, the Sandaime couldn't possibly, either. The Uchiha Council had gotten it completely wrong. The Hokage wasn't their enemy. If anything, the Uchiha should have been his allies against Danzo, who envied their powers and his robes of office. He was a ruthless, underhanded warmonger to a degree that would have made Madara proud. All of those petty annoyances the Uchiha suffered could easily have been orchestrated without the Hokage's consent or knowledge. In fact, it was the perfect plan. The Hokage would take the blame while the real perpetrator used him as a shield, emerging from the debacle with all of his goals met and not a smudge on him. The problem was that she hadn't a shred of proof, and once Fugaku set his mind to something it was almost impossible to put him off the track. Mikoto loved her family, but she loved Konoha just as fiercely. Even if the coup succeeded without complications, and that was a very large if, Konoha would be weakened. If it degenerated into an all-out civil war, which she thought was more likely, the wolves would circle and leap in to devour any scraps the infighting had left. With the land of fire practically defenseless as Konoha's shinobi turned on each other, the lightning and earth daimyos could carve up their neighbor at leisure even with Kiri's aid. Konoha would be destroyed as utterly in the Fourth Great War as Uzushio had been in the Third. If she chose her clan, she might be forced to turn her blades against her last surviving teammate. Her students. Her sensei's son. Maybe her own son. And still her home would probably fall all for lies and vengeance. That retribution was more important to Fugaku than his firstborn, whom he had trained so carefully and praised so highly. That was the great flaw of the Uchiha. She had struggled with her desire for vengeance against the Kyuubi and won, and now she couldn't even imagine how empty her life would have been without Naruto in it. Fugaku had given in. Under all of his pretensions, he was weaker than she, too much of a coward to refuse to sacrifice her son's life. She was so frustrated she thought she might lose her mind. An Uchiha wife was supposed to accept her powerlessness, and wear her obedience with the same grace as her embroidered silks. Her husband's word was law. Her Sharingan was a gift to pass on to the next generation, not a tool she herself had any business using. In sum, when she became a wife, she ceased to be a shinobi. But matter how hard they tried, no one could ever really stop being a shinobi. Chapter 9. After the conversation with Fugaku, Mikoto considered, and then discarded, the idea of going to Itachi. He had blocked her off so completely from his true feelings, she wasn't sure whose side he had settled on. Her intuition told her that his loyalties had fallen with the Hokage, against his family, but he could be wavering, like she had. He was much too guarded, and too perceptive, to allow her to pry the truth out of him too much like herself. But he was not the only direct line to the Hokage that she could tap. His captain would do just as well. She sent a message to Kakashi as soon as she felt she could, in Itachi's handwriting. The forgery may or may not have been able to fool him, but it would see Yushi and her from suspicions on the Uchiha side, and pique Kakashi's interest regardless. She had gone to meet with him once already over the question of Naruto. If she had been observed, it could be passed off as a coincidence. She had no legitimate reason to be meeting the Hokage's own hound for a friendly cup of tea a second time. She would have to go in disguise to avoid suspicion, and there would be nothing out of the ordinary about a young jonin meeting his captain to discuss some minor mission details. Although she had no idea what he was doing, since it was classified, she had a general sense of Itachi's mission schedule. It was enough to write a vague, yet passable, note to Kakashi about his team's next assignment, and request a meeting. She had completed such infiltration missions in enemy territory before, using a combination of her superb acting skills and a cloak of genjutsu. She'd never tried it in her own village, but the principles were the same. As Itachi's mother, she knew his mannerisms inside out, his gait and his patterns of speech. They were of a similar build, too, since for all of his responsibilities, he was only 13. Itachi had yet to fill out the body of the man he was growing up to be. Under the cover of night, with a touch of illusion to broaden her shoulders and dull the bluish sheen of her hair, her disguise would be able to fool almost anyone. Genjutsu that subtle, when one wasn't looking for it, could even pass under a Sharingan without notice. It wouldn't be able to fool Kakashi for long, but it didn't have to. All she needed was to get him alone long enough for her to explain her purpose. Her only concern on the clan's side was Shisui, now that his standing surveillance mission from Fugaku was in place. Besides being a shinobi of incredible skill, he had known Itachi almost since the day he was born, and would be able to spot an impersonator. He was also one of the few Uchiha with the chakra reserves and reputation to keep his Sharingan activated almost constantly. Fugaku had put him on personal leave from the military police, ostensibly out of consideration for his father's rapidly declining health, and his mother's fragile mental state, but really to keep him free to monitor Itachi. If Mikoto made even the slightest mistake, and perhaps even if she didn't, the ruse would be discovered. That meant she needed him out of the way. Oh. Mikoto hardly needed an excuse to visit another council member's household, but Shisui's appearance at the meeting, and not his father's, had dropped one on her lap. She was on reasonably good terms with Shisui's mother Misao, although Misao was much older than Mikoto, and had a tendency to be spiteful. Her husband's health had been worsening for some time, and she truly did want to give the woman whatever comfort that she could. He was old, and the physicians suspected that there were tumors in his lungs, an affliction even Konoha's medics couldn't cure. The family was, if anything, even more hidebound than hers, and if Fugaku hadn't seen fit to bring Mikoto herself into the fold, it was doubtful Misao was even aware of the coup. She spent the morning on errands, running back and forth to the pharmacy and the flower shop to assemble a basket for Shisui's father. Arrayed in a reserved, dark blue kimono with the Uchiha crest embroidered on the collar, Mikoto rang their doorbell, basket slung over her arm. There was no immediate answer, and she was afraid she'd mistimed it. Not only would that put her work this morning to waste, but if she wanted to get in touch with Kakashi, she needed Shisui otherwise occupied. She put her hand to the door, and let her chakra senses curl past it and through the house. There were 2 people inside, on the 2nd floor. One of them moved toward her, and she quickly withdrew the tendrils of her awareness. Snooping like that was considered by other censors to be quite rude when among friends. Eventually, Shisui slid open the front door. His dark, wavy hair was unbrushed, and he looked very tired, but he smiled wanly when he recognized the caller. Like most of the Uchiha, he was on the tall side, with a wiry frame that was suited to use grace and speed over brute strength. He was dressed in civilian clothes, and was not wearing his hitayate, although his shurinan was smoldering as always. Mikoto Obazan. Come in, he said, stepping aside to let her pass. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting, I was upstairs. Their home was very similar to hers, spacious and tastefully decorated, although there was a film of grime and dust on the floor. Misao had more to worry about than the details of her housekeeping. For your father, Mikoto said, handing the basket to Shisui, before she knelt in the foyer to undo her sandals. Is Misao home? No, he said. She's at the dispensary, picking up some medications. She should be back soon. Would you like some tea while you wait? No, thank you, she said. But, I did want to speak with you, since you're here. Shisui cocked his head, pausing from sorting through the contents of her gift basket. Is something wrong? He asked. You seem anxious. No, no, she said, waving him off. He didn't believe her, because she was. He'd be able to pick up on her nervousness no matter how well she thought she was hiding it. It didn't matter. He wasn't a Yamanaka, and he couldn't read minds. All she had to do was redirect that attention. I'm sorry, it's a little disconcerting at a time like this. Your shurinan, I just feel like I'm being interrogated. I have a lot of enemies, he said. It's habit, nothing personal. Mikoto smiled widely. None in your own house, I'd hope. Shisui closed his eyes briefly, and when he reopened them they were a plain dark brown. Of course not. For her sake, Mikoto sincerely hoped that turned out to be true. Fugaku had selected him as the council's puppet Hokage for a reason. He was incredibly powerful, and not a man she would willingly tangle with. His command of the Shunshinjutsu was so masterful he was often favorably compared with the young Minato. It wasn't a true space/time jutsu, like the former Hokage's, but he was so fast it hardly mattered. She had watched him and Itachi spar, though their version of that activity was so deadly it barely met the definition of the word. He needed no hand seals to use the Shunshin, and could combine a dozen or more bursts of that chakra-enhanced speed into one devastating assault. Without her shurinan activated, he was a blur of blue and silver. With her shurinan, it was like watching the most disciplined of dancers, with every motion put to a precise and lethal purpose. According to Itachi, who was not given to exaggeration, Shisui once single-handedly defeated a whole team of Kiri Hunternin. 3 of them were Jonin, and one of those was the bastard that ripped out the eye of a still-breathing Hyuga genin 6 months earlier. And Shisui had been completely unarmed. His skill wasn't the only thing that frightened her. If you scratched that polite, friendly exterior, you'd find a fanatic underneath. There had always been hints of it, as he was growing up. Mikoto truly didn't want to hurt him, but as he was so stubborn, she was afraid she might not have a choice. Shisui led her into the living room, and sank into the couch with a sigh, resting his sinewy arms on his knees. Mikoto followed, settling down beside him. How is he? She asked gently. Now? Asleep, he answered to the floor. He's in too much pain to do much else, even with the narcotics that the medics gave him. They said it's probably spread into his bones. He doesn't have long. I'm so sorry, she said, placing a comforting hand between his shoulder blades. If there's anything I can do for you or Misao, please ask. He nodded, grateful. I need him to hold on longer. To witness the rebirth of the Uchiha. She said quietly. You were listening, he said, unsurprised, unfolding from the slouch to look at her. My husband knows I can be trusted, Mikoto said, although the untruth of the words rasped at her tongue. He thinks of you as his own son, and I know you'd do anything for the clan, but, I'm afraid he's asking too much of you. Now, especially. If you need some time with your father, I can give it to you. I'm sure I can come up with something to keep Itachi at home for a night or two this week, before he leaves on the Tachugawa mission. Shisui smiled a little. That would be. He started, and exhaled heavily. Thank you. It could be days or months. No one knows. He was silent for a little while, and in the quiet she could hear a few labored coughs from upstairs. About Itachi, maybe you can get him to talk to you. I've tried to get him to open up, but he barely speaks to me anymore. I don't think he's a traitor, but he's closer to the Hokage than any of us in the police force. This act is wearing him down. I know. I've tried, believe me. Sasuke is practically the only person that he's civil to at this point, she said. Sometimes, I've thought. He said, trailing off into troubled silence. Itachi may have the Uchiha eyes, but he isn't one of us, deep inside. He would have been happier growing up in a monastery, not in a hidden village. He cares too much. Always has and probably always will, even if he's gotten better at pretending that he doesn't. I'm not sure how much longer he'll be able to survive as a murderer before he loses his mind. Mikoto often had the same thought, as much as it hurt to admit that to herself. It's too late for what-ifs. He's a shinobi now, she said, resigned. Maybe he'll find a way to live at peace with what he is. Not all of us make our living as assassins. There's the medical specialists, the couriers, the tactical analysts, the teachers, the cryptographers. Shisui didn't look optimistic. He's too good at killing. No Kage in their right mind would have him do anything but. Her response was cut off as she heard the sounds of a key in a lock at the back door, and gave Shisui a consoling smile before rising to greet Misao. He withdrew upstairs to see to his father. Misao tossed the packages of pills on the counter, and wearily greeted Mikoto. The pleasantries were brief, quickly dissolving into tears. All shinobi expected, on some level, to fall bravely in battle against overwhelming odds. They could not help but feel some shame to dying slowly in their own beds. Seeing her husband in such a state was tearing her friend apart. She let the woman cry on her shoulder for a while, feeling like a snake. With her husband and son so deeply entangled in the plot, it was doubtful that Misao would even live to see its resolution. In all likelihood she was ignorant, but the Hokage was much less generous with his mercy after Orochimaru's defection. Perhaps he knew now that it had been the wrong choice. Mikoto made empty, soothing noises and wondered if this meant that it was her fault her friend was going to die. When she finally steadied herself, Mikoto bid her good afternoon, promising to come by again tomorrow to help around the house in any way she could. Oh. Shisui gratefully accepted her offer during her visit the next day, as she predicted he would. Now, the problem was fulfilling her end of the deal. Fugaku was still clinging to the wisps of authority he had over Itachi, but Mikoto had nothing. The only way to get him to do anything was through Sasuke. She had Kushina to thank for her solution. In her genin days, Mikoto had stumbled upon a poison, but a not very dangerous one, that made you look awfully like you were coming down with the flu for about 3 hours. By the time the doctor's notes were written, and the victim ensconced comfortably in bed, the symptoms evaporated. Then, they had a sick day to enjoy without the discomfort of actually being sick. Kushina had seized on the concoction as the most perfect way to play hooky ever invented, and had stolen the formula from underneath Mikoto's nose. For a brief period, it had made her quite popular among her yearmates whenever a sewer maintenance mission came up. Kushina then went and created a thriving black market for the stuff among the full ranks of Konoha genin, and at one point expanded her little empire in Tataki and Kusa over the course of one of the Chunin exams. It had netted Kushina a considerable stash of hard cash and favors, at least until the medics got wise to it. Once her teammates' ruse had been uncovered, Mikoto had written off the formula as useless in a combat situation, and tossed it. But when they were older, half as a joke, Kushina had slipped it into the card for her bridal shower. She followed with a whispered suggestion to dump a vialful into the rehearsal dinner's punch, and elope with Deus Hero in the ensuing chaos. Mikoto kept the card in a shoebox, along with a few odds and ends the absent-minded Kushina had left at her house, and then never claimed. It was lucky she didn't have the heart to throw them away. All she had to do was put a few drops of the poison in Sasuke's lunchbox, and arrange it so Itachi was the only one home to care for him. He had been assigned early morning patrols recently, from 6 in the morning to about 3. He was home when Sasuke returned from school, although he usually locked himself in his bedroom to sleep or meditate. She could depend on Sasuke to play his part beautifully. He wasn't nearly as stoic as his older brother and would come sniffing for sympathy as soon as he started feeling ill. Itachi wouldn't leave him home alone if he was spiking a high fever, neatly keeping her promise to Shisui. The day of the meeting with Kakashi, Mikoto mixed up a very special thermos of tomato soup for Sasuke, a treat that she knew would not end up as a bargaining chip in the complexities of lunchroom politics. She pulled her maid Iriko along on an impromptu day trip to the nearest onsen, to give herself an alibi. They gossiped in the water for a while, and after late lunch, Iriko wished her good night, making her way home before it got too dark. As soon as she disappeared around a bend in the mountain road, Mikoto collected her things and made her way back to Konoha by much faster means, using chakra to propel herself through the thick forest. She passed through the gates unhindered by the bespelled Chunin guards, and left a Kage Bunshin behind with instructions to enter hours later. The real Mikoto then disappeared into an alley to change hastily into the set of Itachi's clothes that she'd secreted in her bag. The backpack she left hidden in the alley to collect later. Her genjutsu was excellent, but the more of the disguise that was physically real, the less chance it would be seen through. Kakashi was renowned as a master tracker. His sense of smell was probably on par with an Inyazuka, and she couldn't craft the illusion of a scent that she couldn't perceive. A perfect replica of Itachi emerged from the alley, and began walking purposefully down the gently curving street that hugged the defensive wall. Kakashi had suggested the meeting place, a dingy shinobi bar that was barely more than a closet. Konoha had a lot of bars. In a hidden village, there were more than enough sorrows to drown. Oh. The establishment was split into 2 levels, with a narrow counter on the first, and a few tables up a steep and rickety staircase. The bartender came by Mikoto's table with a flask of sake and 2 cups, without being asked. Itachi was, or had been, until lately, a scrupulously courteous person, a quality that she had drummed into his head as a boy. Itachi would wait for Kakashi before pouring himself a drink, no matter how late the man was. Mikoto settled in for a wait in the shadows of the tiny bar. Itachi was apparently a frequent customer here. A few other patrons, all shinobi, nodded in greeting, but didn't try to engage him in conversation. This was probably an Umbu hangout, and by extension dangerous for outsiders. For the first time, Mikoto was thankful for her son's taciturn nature. She didn't know who any of these men were, and wouldn't have even been able to speak to them for more than a few minutes without giving herself away. And that could turn out to be lethal. Kakashi arrived only 10 minutes after she did. "Yo," he said, and slid into his seat. "If I've told the barkeep once, I've told him a dozen times. Sake for me, milk for you. Someday the cops are gonna to bust him for selling to minors, and then where am I gonna go for a cheap drink?" It was an old joke. Kakashi reached for the flask and poured for both of them without waiting for a response. "What did you want to ask me, anyway? I thought the plan for the Tachugawa mission was decided yesterday. You're going in first, and Genma and I will keep the general's bodyguards out of your hair. I know, but I reconsidered your entrance vector, and thought there might be a better way." Kakashi raised the cup, grunted, and put it down again. "You did? That's funny, since Genma's been on leave for 3 days, and is probably so fucking plastered he's swallowed that stupid senbon of his by now." His voice never lost his indolent tone as he continued. "I've got to admit you make a damn good Itachi, but since you aren't the genuine article, I think you and I should leave now. Keep your hands where I can see them, drinks are on me. We're going to walk out the back, you first. Then I'm going to incapacitate you and introduce you to my good friends at the Umbu Torture and Interrogation Force. How painful this will be for you depends on how cooperative you're feeling." Enjoy the rest of your evening. That won't be necessary, Mikoto said, rising calmly. I'd also prefer someplace more private to discuss what I came here to tell you. She walked to the back of the bar, Kakashi following close behind, and pushed open the door leading to the iron fire escape that zigzagged down the back of the building. The moment it shut behind her, her legs and arms went completely numb, and Kakashi caught her as she crumpled, pricking a kunai against her throat in one fluid motion. The speed at which he'd executed the Kanashibari jutsu was inhuman. We need to talk, she said, in her own voice. I came here disguised as Itachi for my own safety, not to trick you. Mikoto, he said incredulously, his arm momentarily tightening on her bound breasts beneath Itachi's borrowed shirt. What the hell is this? He released the invisible bindings on her legs and arms and stepped back, although he did not return his kunai to its holster. He'd pushed his Hitai level on his forehead, and Obito's Sharingan flashed in the lantern lights. Still a little unsteady on her feet from the after effects of the technique, she released the henge, and stood with a steadying hand on the guardrail. The sharper lines of Itachi's face faded away. Like I said, I need somewhere more private, and I'll explain everything. I cannot be seen speaking to you, she said urgently. My apartment is down the street. That would do, she answered. As Numbu captain, Kakashi would be a paranoid bastard. It would as secure as anywhere else nearby, and the fewer opportunities that another Uchiha had to see her, the better. No offense, he said, but I'm still not letting you get behind me. And if you try to put me under a genjutsu, I'll knock you out, and then hand you over to the TNI with a bow around your neck. Impersonating a no-Numbu operative is a capital crime. None taken, she assured him, and I'm fully aware of the penalty. In his position, knowing what he knew, she wouldn't have done any differently. As far as Kakashi was concerned, Mikoto was just as much of an enemy of the Hokage as her husband. Tell me where I'm going, please. He gave her a few terse directions, and waited for her to take the lead. She restored the henge to pass under the attention of any watching eyes. Following his instructions, Mikoto landed on the roof of a brick apartment building at the end of the block, and swung down to one of the doors on the third floor. Kakashi's apartment was very small, rather dusty, and as impersonal as a hotel room, aside from one enormous bookshelf filled with pornography. She dropped the disguise as soon as Kakashi threw the curtains shut. Despite the tension of the situation, he managed to look embarrassed for a moment, when he saw her lips purse in disapproval at his choice of reading material. He flicked on the light and directed her to sit on the only chair, in front of a battered desk scattered with a few mission reports. He hastily gathered them up and shoved them in the desk drawer. Kakashi, evidently, did not entertain company. He remained standing, arms crossed over his chest, radiating a cold killing intent that told Mikoto he could ensure that she did not leave the room alive. The easygoing, lazy Hatake Kakashi most people saw on the streets of Konoha had faded away. Now, she was dealing with the Hound. You'd better have one hell of an explanation for this, he said in a low voice. She sat straight and still, refusing to be ground down by his intimidating stance. Can I assume, she began, that you are aware my husband is plotting to assassinate the Hokage? Yes, he said, revealing neither shock nor where he had picked up that piece of information. Then I will also assume that my son is playing double agent, and funneling intelligence from the Uchiha to the Hokage, as opposed to the reverse. Kakashi didn't answer that one. She therefore assumed that was also yes. Good. I had hoped he'd decided where his loyalties lay. Mikoto took a deep breath. I approached you because I wasn't entirely sure about Itachi. I don't think I've ever understood that boy, and I raised him. The intimidating silence continued. I came under an illusion because I can't afford to cast suspicion on my loyalties. I may have been seen when we met in the Three Orchids to discuss Naruto. There's a message I want you to pass to the Hokage for me. Itachi isn't the only Uchiha with an interest in preventing the civil war that will descend if my husband puts his plans into motion. I have the experience in diplomacy, and the political connections, that Itachi does not. Before any drastic solutions are considered, the Hokage should be made aware that knowledge of this plot is confined to the Council of Elders. Most of the clan is wholly ignorant. If I can reach them first, I believe I can keep many, if not most, of the lower-ranking family members loyal to Konoha. Individual Uchiha are powerful, but without grassroots support, Fugaku simply won't have the numbers necessary for a coup to succeed. I want to end this without bloodshed. In addition, she continued, my husband trusts me in a way he no longer trusts Itachi. The intelligence I can provide will be more comprehensive, and of potentially higher quality. Kakashi considered her words. His Sharingan had been hovering on her as she spoke. She had no doubt he was adept at using it to pick out the minute physical changes that were indicative of someone attempting to lie. The tautness in the air relaxed, and he pulled his Hitayate down over his left eye. Mikoto allowed herself a small sigh of relief. Why would you do this? He asked softly. Betray your own husband. Mikoto felt guilt curl beneath her breastbone. Was this betrayal? To cross a man who'd crossed her first? He'd belittled her entire life as a shinobi, threatened to kill her son by blood, and was planning to turn her son by chance over to a psychopath who murdered children for pure sport. It couldn't be called betrayal. But it still felt like it. Because I'm a jonin of Konoha who knows where their duty lies, same as you. She said, with more heat toward Kakashi than she'd intended. She took a deep breath, and let the misdirected anger drain away. I feel as though Kushina entrusted me with something I can't toss away. The coup will destroy what she and Minato gave their lives for. I spent so many years playing at being the obedient wife, pretending the most important things were someone else's problem. I realize now that I'm not helpless, I gave up the power to change things willingly, and now I want to take it back. Mikoto thought she could sense some kind of approval from him, the man whose entire life was shaped by the memories of those he had lost. I'll tell the Hokage what you told me, Kakashi said. He will want to speak to you in person. No written records of this conversation can be made. You'll receive a message detailing when and where you'll be expected. I understand, she said, rising and renewing the illusion of Itachi's appearance. She turned to the door. Mikoto-sama, he added, to her back. Thank you. I don't know how he manages it, given our job description, but Itachi is still a good kid. I've never met another shinobi more committed to a peaceful Konoha than he is. Kakashi paused and exhaled softly. He would fulfill his obligations to the Hokage even if he had to rip out his own heart to do it, and I was afraid that's where this situation was headed. The village council has been discussing contingency plans if the talks with your husband break down completely. Her hand tightened on the door handle, and she looked back over her shoulder. What ve they decided on? Decided on? Nothing, so far, he replied. I'm not even supposed to know this, but the Hokage and Homura-san are both convinced a diplomatic solution is still feasible, and after tonight I'm inclined to agree. Koharu-san is still on the fence, and Danzo has been advocating for drastic measures. He fixed her with a piercing stare. The most thorough, most drastic measures. Even the children, and by Itachi's hand. Chapter 10. Mikoto could admit to herself that she was terrified. She felt like a mouse hiding between two prowling tomcats. One was the Uchiha Council, the known quantity. Her attempts to convince Fugaku the slights against the clan had come from a source besides the Hokage had failed miserably. He'd come to hate the man, but still deeply respected his intelligence, and refused to believe someone so wise could have been tricked. The hoped-for easy resolution wasn't going to happen, and that meant she'd have to go deeper into conspiracy. One slip, and the shift in her loyalties could be uncovered, and if it was they would kill her. Not Fugaku himself, she didn't think he had the will, but his uncle wouldn't have those reservations. He would still remember the young Mikoto, the very literal spitfire, and dedicated soldier, who had so sorely tested the former clan head's patience. The second was Shimura Danzo, who frightened her precisely because she knew so little about him, save that he seemed to want the Uchiha wiped from the face of the earth. He had retained a position as one of the Hokage's advisors for years, even after he retired from his position as the director of Umbu. She didn't think the retirement had been voluntary. It was rumored he'd created his own division within a division, a selection of the most ruthless, emotionless shinobi, from within the ranks of the elite force. Their supposed purpose was to complete missions so morally putrid even the casual murderers of Umbu had balked at them. After the Hokage discovered his one-time friend had been so blatantly subverting his authority, the organization had been disbanded, on paper, and a great deal of Danzo's official power had been removed. But only his official power. It was analogous to lopping the floriade off a dandelion, and hoping the deep roots would wither before they took over the garden the next year. Not at all likely. She suspected he fought the same way she did, indirectly, and from the shadows. Their most powerful weapons were their intelligence, their information networks, and their ability to pass beneath the notice of powerful men. The problem was that Danzo had been doing it for twice as long as she had, and her primarily female gossip channels didn't extend into whatever pits most of his allies were lurking in. Her sources had the advantage of remaining largely invisible to the male population, but her information network had some serious weaknesses. And she suspected Danzo had his own agent among her clansmen. A little bit of digging had turned up his genin team roster, and the name Uchiha Kagami. The sense of loyalty between members of that first team often lasted a lifetime, transcending barriers of blood or law, as Mikoto felt only too keenly. Kagami was in his 60s, and long since retired. He owned a bar a few streets over from police headquarters. Fugaku had been ever so politely thrown out of it once or twice in his youth, clan heir or not. He was a nasty drunk and it was a favorite with the off-duty officers. In all likelihood, Kagami had been watching the clan council's resentment of the Hokage simmer for months, passing choice tidbits to Danzo all the while. That man seemed exactly like the type to milk such a bond as long as it was useful, and as soon as it wasn't, sever it without any regrets. She was operating on too little information, and with too few allies. She passed the days waiting for the Hokage's messenger with her nerves almost on fire. It was far from their fault, but she was short with Sasuke and Naruto, for no good reason. Antics that made her smile a month ago were suddenly worthy of a scolding. She began avoiding her friends in the clan as much as possible, claiming to be ill with persistent headaches. Like the best excuses it was true, the tension of waiting knotted up the muscles of her neck, until the slightest motion set her temples pounding. She could barely face the women with a smile, knowing she might have to kill any of them in the very near future. If this was what Itachi felt like day in and day out, it was no wonder he was slowly going mad. He was on a mission deep in the jungles of South Fire Country, with an unknown partner, and neglected to inform her when he might return. She needed desperately to speak with him, to reassure him, and herself, that they weren't alone in this fight. Oh. Mikoto was sharing a pot of tea, and a basket of mending. In a shinobi household there was never a shortage, with Iriko when Itachi materialized at the front door. Over the buzz of the television set she hadn't heard him coming down the path, and his dampening of his chakra signature was total. He kept that guard up at all times, even in his own family's home. Even she couldn't sense his presence until he walked into the room. She forced herself to remain outwardly unperturbed. "Your mission went well, I hope?" she asked, placing her teacup down on the table, and looking over the back of the sofa. There were fresh scars over his right eye that disappeared into his hairline, like he'd been attacked by a wild animal. The edges were blistered and red, obviously some kind of chemical burn. "How'd you get those?" she asked with concern. "The outcome was satisfactory," he said blandly. "And a rogue puppeteer?" He didn't seem bothered by them. The gashes looked painful, but were well on their way to healing, and must have already been attended to by one of the Umbu medics. "I need to speak with you. Alone." Her maid began to squirm in her seat. She was a bit younger than Mikoto, a distant cousin whose persistent asthma had barred her from attending the Shinobi Academy. Itachi had always made her uncomfortable, and in the past months that had transformed into naked fear. "I'm glad you're all right, Itachi-sama," she whispered meekly. "Mikoto-sama, please excuse me." She put her half-finished mending aside, and sketched off a bow, before turning off the television and fleeing. "Honestly, I'm your mother," she said, once Iriko had left. "You're allowed to speak to me whenever you like." "What's bothering you?" she asked, tidying up the cups and depositing them next to the kitchen sink. "It is Anzu-chan. I'm sure, if you took the time to explain how much pressure you've been under, she'd forgive you. She's a very understanding girl." Itachi put his hand on her shoulder, and leaned over her fall of black hair. His voice was barely audible beside her ear. "In my bedroom. The halls are not secure." Mikoto was very much aware. That was why she was babbling like an idiot about one of her son's many female admirers, instead of acknowledging the topic at hand. Assumptions needed to be carefully tended. She trusted Iriko to a point, but not enough to let S-class secrets slip. She was loyal to Mikoto, but not a shinobi, and too easily bullied. If her husband became suspicious, he could probably threaten whatever he wanted to know out of her with very little effort. She followed Itachi to his bedroom on the pretext of collecting a full load of laundry, and kept up a steady screen of inane chatter. Itachi slid the bolt home behind them, then, with his back to the door, flew through a set of hand seals for a very tight sound suppression jutsu. Instead of simply creating silence, it jumbled the speech of anyone inside the circle. It was then rebroadcast in a new configuration, creating the hum of quiet conversation without any meaning to glean from it. He sat down on the bed, looking pensive. Kakashi Teiko told me about your conversation. And he said, and stopped. I don't understand. Mikoto joined him, tucking one leg under her. Like I told Kakashi-san, I'm still a shinobi, even if I spend my day keeping house, instead of taking missions. It's my duty to identify, and eliminate, threats to Konoha if it's in my power to do so. You'd turn against father? I can't remember you ever challenging him. You've never been anything but obedient to his wishes. Mikoto allowed herself a quiet chuckle, and brushed some of her hair out of her face. After you were born, maybe. You would not believe the fights we got into, when we were engaged. I made his father so angry with my insolent behavior he nearly called off the marriage. His brows pinched in skepticism. You're correct. I'm not sure I do. She shook her head. Nobody will talk about it, because it's too embarrassing to them. Your grandfather wanted me to quit before I made Jonin almost all Uchiha women do, but I refused. We were still at war with Iwa, and I wanted to do my part. And Kushina wouldn't let me buckle without a fight. A flash of understanding passed over his face. He'd never been part of a genin team of his own, it was part of what isolated him so completely from his peers, but he was aware of their character. I've always liked giving orders more than taking them, she continued. That never changed. I never spoke out in front of you because it's not my place, not because I agreed with your father's every word. I had my own ways to set things as I wanted them. You, of all people, should know the best way to win a confrontation is often to ensure it never happens. Ah, he agreed. But I still don't understand why you would turn against the clan. You have more connections than father. Your brother, your friends. Why did you? She asked, a question that had been burning at the back of her mind for months. It's like you became someone else. Even before you joined Umbu. To protect peace, he said simply. No matter how hard they try to deny it to themselves, a coup would spark a fourth world war. If I can do anything to stop it, I will. It was a shade away from being completely true. But her mother's intuition told her he was holding something back. That's part of my reason, she said. I served through one war. It was more than enough blood to last a lifetime. But I must admit the rest is more selfish. She tentatively put her hand on his shoulder, and to her surprise he didn't shrug it off. Your father is willing to have you killed for the sake of his vengeance. And he was willing to turn Naruto over to the Mizukage. I'd die before I let either of those things become a reality. Itachi had gone very still, his eyes downcast. I'm grateful, he breathed. You can't know how much. But don't involve yourself in this. My choice is between my clan and my village, and you must already know what I've chosen. If you truly want to help me, take Sasuke and get out of Konoha before the spring. It hardly matters how you do it, or whether you can secure permission. Sever your ties with the village if you have to, and run as far and as fast as you can. Kumo would take you in. They've always had an unhealthy interest in Konoha's dojutsu. Abandon Konoha and become a rogue ninja? What are you saying? She said, her voice gone sharp with apprehension. When I spoke with Kakashi-san, he said the Hokage hadn't come to a decision yet. He hasn't. There are greater forces at work here. What forces? Danzo? Another Kage? Don't shut me out like this, she said emphatically. I can't help you unless you tell me what's happening. Please, he pleaded, and Itachi never pleaded. If you love me, and you love Konoha, don't ask me to tell you that. Mikoto pushed herself to her feet. She was angry. Furious. The Uchiha pride ran deep, even in a turncoat like Itachi, who was more like his father than he would ever admit. They knew best. They could make the decisions that affected the lives of everyone below them, and never think to ask for advice, or, God forbid, consensus. Most of all, they could never ask for help, no matter what the price. How dare you? She said, her voice thick with fury. Maybe you're on Konoha's side, but you're as bad as your father. You're 13 years old. I don't care how talented a ninja you are, you have no right to make that decision for me, or anyone else in this village, until you're Hokage. I tried to find a way out, he answered dully. For weeks and weeks it was the only thought in my mind. But I cannot bring the Hokage or the council into this, or both sides will be destroyed. Either the Uchiha die, or all of Konoha. There is no choice. No, she shot back. I refuse to believe that. There's always a choice, even if your eyes can't see it. You're intelligent, but you're not infallible. What if someone else has the answer you were groping for? Would you refuse to take that risk? For your cherished pride you are willing to sacrifice your entire clan. Itachi winced away from her tirade, like it was a physical blow, before that old hollow expression returned. He rose. Mother! Get out of my room, he said, his voice level but completely dead. No, she said, shaking with rage. I won't. There are good men and women in our clan. They're as loyal to the Hokage as I am. There are housewives, and servants, who've never worn a hitai. There are little children. Babies. Would you kill them to save Konoha? I will do what is necessary, he answered. You think I won't? I will say this one more time. Get out, or I will remove you. I have resources of my own, she continued, ignoring the threat. And with, or without, your help I will find out who issued this ultimatum. Perhaps the Hokage will be able to find the answer in Kirigakure. You will not go to Kiri, he ordered. If you do you will damn us all. Since when did he give her orders? Umbu drank Jonin in the general mission pool, but he was a 13-year-old boy, and there was no way in hell she was going to let him speak that way to his mother. You'll have to stop me, then, she said. Here and now. Mikoto felt her feet sliding into a fighting stance, and her Sharingan flamed into being along with Itachi's. He had never seen it before, she had only been the gentle mother to him. Never the shinobi. Could you do that, I wonder? She asked, with vicious calm. Strike down your own mother in cold blood. They stood tense and silent, their Sharingan locked for long moments. Mikoto felt some of her rage beginning to unknot itself, the deeper she looked into his eyes, then more, and more, until she couldn't even remember why they'd been arguing. Her fingers relaxed, and her hands dropped slowly to her sides. And why was her Sharingan on? What could possibly possess her to? Mikoto forced out a breath between clenched teeth, and tore apart the cobwebs of false memory with a mental shiver. You will never do that again, do you understand me? She said harshly. Itachi's eyes narrowed. He had not suspected she would be mentally agile enough to shake off such a well-crafted genjutsu, but there was a lot about her children didn't know. That was for your own good, mother, he said. It would have been easier. For my own good, she repeated. Since when did you become my keeper? Do you think I've gone senile at 35? Itachi ignored her question. Since you are so insistent, we will do this the other way. In close quarters, she was no match for him, and she knew it. Her eyes tracked his leap, but her legs were too poorly conditioned to dodge it. He kicked her feet out from under her, and grabbed her arm as she stumbled, twisting it behind her back. She was forced to her knees. Her eyes caught the glint of a needle between his fingers, and a fraction of a second later she felt it prick into the tenketsu point below her ear. She was utterly at his mercy. He could thrust the senbon in, and paralyze her, break her neck, anything he chose to ensure her silence. All she could do was breathe, and listen to her pulse throb in her ears. She almost screamed with the tension, but bit down on her lip to keep her silence. Had she misjudged him? She knew his will was steel, cold and unyielding, but he was her son. That emotional distance he had created between himself and his clan was his shield from the horror of what he believed he had to do. She had knocked that shield aside with one blow, but was it enough? He had first killed at the age of 8, and then again, and again, and again. What was one more sliver of metal into one more woman's neck? And then the needle's prick drew back, and the grip immobilizing her wrist relaxed. The senbon chattered against the floor. She hardly dared to breathe, until Itachi took 3 steps back, and hit the wall with his palms open and slid down. She pushed herself up, and turned on the balls of her feet to look at him. His eyes were closed, and she saw them moving beneath the lids, as if replaying the scene inside of his head. "Madara," he whispered hoarsely. "The man who ordered me to wipe out the Uchiha was Madara." Mikoto felt something drop out from beneath her. Itachi was an excellent liar, but he did not spin tales, and was almost impossible to deceive. "Madara was killed 100 years ago," she said, if only to reassure herself. "And even if by some miracle he survived the battle at the Valley of the End, he'd be long dead of old age by now." Itachi opened his eyes, and slowly shook his head. "The Shodai only thought he was dead," he said. "Madara survived, and went into hiding, to regain his strength. During that time he must have discovered a jutsu to prolong his life. They do exist. When Orochimaru was banished he had nearly succeeded in creating one. Madara has spent the last 100 years manipulating the cages like Suna puppet masters towards a goal I still have not been able to tease out of him, although I do know destroying Konoha is one of his many aims. He has been spying on us for years, on me, using Kiri as a screen. The Yondaime Mizukage, Yagura, is completely under his control. The spy the police caught this summer," she whispered. "One of Madara's," Itachi confirmed. "And only the beginning. He made contact with father, posing as one of the Mizukage's agents. This agent is the one who gave the impression that Kiri would lend their support to the new regime. Who else knows?" she asked, dazed by the blow to her reality. Madara was one of the most powerful shinobi to have ever lived. That his will was directed against her family was almost too evil to contemplate. He shrugged, unsure. "In Konoha, probably only the 2 of us. In Kiri, the newest of the 7 swordsmen of the mist is aware that he's the true Mizukage. I don't know his name, but he carries a sharkskin sword. Madara had me spar with him to display my abilities. There were others, but I don't know from which villages. I gathered they were all rogue ninja. He is collecting the strongest of them, from all over the continent." She slipped out of her crouch, and tucked her ankles under her thighs, her head bent in shock. "I can't. Why did he encourage a coup if he ordered you to destroy the Uchiha?" she asked. "It doesn't make sense." "He's insane," Itachi said shortly. "The only thing he hates more than the Senju are the Uchiha who took their hands in friendship. He believes we are traitors to destiny, and that it's his duty to correct this transgression. But when father sent me to Kiri he saw in me a worthy pupil, and his plans changed. Originally, he wanted the coup to succeed, and in doing so Konoha would have destroyed itself. He would have had Kiri pull out at a critical time, and Kumo would have overwhelmed us. I agreed to abandon the village, and follow him, only if he spared it. It was all I could do to convince him, in return for revenge against the Uchiha. He's still bitter we turned on him when the village was founded." Itachi looked up at her, the anguish she had felt from him for once written plainly on his face. "As I am now, there's no way I have the skill to kill him. All I can do is follow him, and hope that in time I can learn his weakness, or at the very least provide Konoha with inside intelligence about the rogue ninja he's assembling. Now do you understand my choice?" Mikoto couldn't even answer. Everything she thought she knew had been torn away. To reveal a future so bleak looking into it made her throat ache with tears of horror. Who could hope to stand up to Madara? Even the Shodai Hokage, a man of incredible power who had fought him in the prime of his life, had failed to kill him. Their battle had rent the earth itself, gouging a new path for the river separating the land of fire from the land of rice, and scorched the earth for miles around. He'd come so close, but, in the end, had failed. She raked a hand through her hair, her eyes squeezed shut. Intellectually, she knew Itachi had made the right decision, putting the lives of many before the lives of a few. Logic before emotion. And not only would Itachi be sacrificing his family, he'd be consigning himself to a lifetime of indescribable suffering. Once he completed his task and joined Madara, there would be no going back. Some had whispered that he was truly the epitome of what an assassin ought to be, that his cold demeanor was because he truly felt nothing like love or pity. But beneath those layers upon layers of ice, she suspected, just as his teacher Shisui had suspected, that Itachi had a gentle soul. He did love his family. He loved them more deeply than they would ever know, and the last thing they would ever see were his eyes blazing with madness as he struck the killing blows. He would be reviled as a traitor, a butcher, a monster. Down that path, he would be joining what would likely become the most ruthless terrorist organization in the world, and subsume himself completely in what he loathed above all else. All for Konoha. And there was nothing she could do to save him. Yes, she whispered. She stopped. Drew in a sharp breath. There, hovering at the edge of her mind, she could make out a glimmer of hope. She cast herself towards it, desperately. If Madara was still as powerful as he was 100 years ago, why bother using Itachi and the Mizukage? Why cower in the shadows? Wouldn't he want to deliver his vengeance with his own two hands, if he had the strength to do so? Did you ever think, she said softly, that Madara is manipulating you? Itachi's brows knit in doubt, so she forged ahead before he could disagree. I know you. I know how much you love Konoha. I know how much you take on your own shoulders, to spare the people around you. And I think Madara knows this too. What if he's maneuvered you into keeping this secret, not because he plans to wipe out all of Konoha himself, but because he can't? What purpose could keeping a promise to you serve for him? You told me yourself you couldn't hope to defeat him in single combat. If he's as immortal as he seems, he'd be able to find a more willing student eventually. It would be more logical for him to pursue Sasuke, who has the same potential you do without the independence. What if he's counting on your keeping his survival a secret, because he wouldn't be able to overcome the full might of Konoha working against him? Itachi swallowed convulsively, looking more unsure than she'd ever seen him. If you're wrong, Konoha will be obliterated. That is true, she answered. But even if I am, it's not a question of if, but when. What would stop him from returning for the rest, once the Uchiha were executed, and you had fled? Itachi's eyes lost their focus, as if he was looking far into the future she had described. Rogue ninja did not usually lead long lives. They were always running, forever hunted, unable to place their trust in anyone, or anything, but their own wits and blades. Nothing, he whispered after long moments. Nothing at all. At least he had the grace to look ashamed. I was sure I was beyond his reach. I should have known it was beyond my power to convince him of anything. If I was in your place, I'm not sure I could have realized it either. Sometimes it takes another pair of eyes, looking in, to really see the truth. He raised his head, a real spark of feeling returning to his face. He got to his feet, and offered her his hand to rise. I'll tell the Hokage immediately. Your audience with him will be tomorrow, at midnight. Pay a visit to the Nara pharmacy at 2, and tell Nara Yoshino-san you're picking up your prescription. In the bag will be a scroll, with your gear sealed inside. Change on the way, where you will not be seen. When you approach the Hokage's tower, another agent will accompany you inside as if making a report. Father will be otherwise occupied, and I will ensure Shisui is nowhere near the Uchiha district. Understood, she said, and glanced at the door. Iriko will be wondering what happened to me. I know, he said. Things should not appear to change between us, or father will become suspicious. I still will not be able to speak to you freely, but there is more you need to know about what we're going up against. What is it? She asked. Do you know of the secret room below the floor of the clan shrine? Were you shown when you mastered your Sharingan? Mikoto shook her head. For a kunoichi to gain a third tomo is an embarrassment, not an accomplishment. This is the first I've heard of it. The trapdoor is hidden beneath the mats, 7th from the far right. It contains the only written record of the secrets of the Sharingan, and the history of the clan before the village's founding. He looked away for a moment. You won't like what you'll see. The heartwood of our clan is rotten. The elders have always secretly aspired to follow in Madara's footsteps. He told me many have tried. I can go tomorrow, before the meeting, she said, and added, you were shown when you became a jonin, weren't you? And all this time you thought I knew. Yes, he said. I regret my mistake. It would have made things easier to know someone. He shook his head. It no longer matters now, but there is one more thing. If you truly care for Uzumaki Naruto, you should know that Madara is after the Kyuubi. This is not the first time he's tried for it. Naruto? She said, caught off guard. What did? And then Fugaku's ranting all came back in a rush. The man in the white mask, and his crimson eyes. Danzo hadn't been lying. Madara must have taken the opportunity to attack Konoha when the current Jinchuriki was in labor, and her husband too preoccupied with maintaining her seal, to adequately defend the village. It was Madara that orphaned Naruto, Madara that murdered her mother and her twin brothers. He made all the widows, the motherless children, the brave shinobi that survived, but would never walk, or see, or speak again. The homes destroyed, the shrines desecrated. In her chest rose a savage desire to find him for the sole purpose of ripping his throat out with her bare hands. It was a white heat that eclipsed the comfortable old hatred she had nursed for the Kyuubi. He was a man, not a demon whose very nature was destruction. Men had choices. And he had chosen to destroy hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives for no gain but his own. He, of all people, ought to be taught suffering, and she could be the mother. Itachi said sharply, taking her roughly by the shoulder, as the wave of loathing crested and broke around them. Hatred is a dangerous tool. I need you to promise me you will not go after him for your own vengeance. You know he killed she began, savage. I know exactly what he's done, and it's more than I've told you. But you said yourself the only way to defeat him is by working together, and an avenger fights alone. If you take that path he will kill you. Itachi drew her eyes into his. Sasuke is going to lose his father before this is all over. I don't think he could bear to lose his mother as well. She began. The choice was like a rasp against her heart, lose her change at vengeance, or leave her sons orphans. It was frightening how tempting the second option was, and it disgusted her how much consideration she was giving it. I won't, she said finally. Look me in the eyes and swear it. Mikoto licked her lips, and deactivated her Sharingan. She was still a shinobi of the Uchiha, and they lived and died for vengeance. But she knew now that counted for less than she'd always been taught. If Itachi could hold his hatred in check for the people that depended on him, so could she. Sasuke and Naruto needed her. I swear on my mother's grave. I will do my best to put an end to Madara, whether or not the final blow is mine. That's it for part 3. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.